It is July 13th, 2026, and overnight, something happened in the Strait of Hormuz that most of the world will only understand in fragments over the next several days. Satellite feeds and Central Command releases show a stretch of Iran's southern coastline going dark, target by target, in a sequence too precise to be improvised. Missile batteries, naval assets, coastal radar, ammunition depots. One after another, the lights simply stop. Officials confirmed that within a single night, roughly 140 Iranian military sites were struck, the third such wave in under a week. And by morning, the running total for the campaign had crossed 300 targets. That number alone should stop you. But it is not even the most important detail in this story. Not close. Because while that strike package was still being executed, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament and the country's lead negotiator on the maritime agreement now unraveling in real time, posted a warning on social media. He wrote that America still had not learned that bullying and breaking promises are no longer cost-free, and cautioned Washington not to flail around pointlessly, because the Strait of Hormuz would only reopen through what he called Iranian arrangements, not American threats. Bold language. The kind of language designed to project strength to a domestic audience and defiance to an international one. But here's the part that makes the statement almost surreal in hindsight. As those words were being typed and published, American aircraft were already airborne, already inside the execution phase of a strike sequence that had been planned, briefed, and authorized hours earlier. The era of one-sided deals, as Ghalibaf put it, was indeed ending, just not in the direction he intended. Read that again? Because it matters. A senior Iranian official was publicly asserting control over the most important maritime choke point on Earth at the exact moment his country's military infrastructure along that choke point was being systematically dismantled. That is not defiance. That is a government narrating a version of events that no longer matches the operational reality on the ground. And understanding how Iran arrived at this moment, why its own signed commitments collapsed within weeks, and what the United States has actually built in response requires backing all the way up, because the last 72 hours did not happen in isolation. They are the final violent expression of a crisis that has been building since February. Let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building for months. This entire chapter of the U.S.-Iran relationship traces back to failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva and a 12-day air war between Israel and Iran that erupted earlier this year. In the lead-up to that conflict, Iran had already signaled its willingness to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz, briefly restricting passage as a warning shot to Washington and Tel Aviv. In the days before the February strikes actually began, U.S. war planners understood the risk clearly. The Joint Chiefs of Staff explicitly warned the White House that any strike on Iran carried a real possibility that Tehran would respond by closing the strait outright. Iran, for its part, spent those same days quietly moving oil. Exports tripled in a matter of days as tankers rushed to clear inventory before any blockade could trap it in port, and Saudi Arabia made similar defensive moves with its own export flow. Insurance markets felt it immediately. War risk premiums for transiting the strait jumped from a fraction of a percent to as much as 0.4% of a vessel's insured value, a shift that, on a single supertanker, can add $250,000 to the cost of one transit. That is, the financial nervous system of the global economy visibly flinching before a shot was even fired. Then the shots were fired. Israel struck Iran. Iran struck back. The United States entered the conflict directly. 12 days of war followed, ending not with a lasting resolution, but with an uneasy truce, one of several ceasefires this relationship has produced and broken since February. And this is where the story, most casual observers lost track of the details. On June 17th, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed what became known as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, an agreement intended to formally end the fighting and lift the naval blockade the U.S. had imposed on Iranian shipping. In exchange, Iran committed to reopening the Strait of Hormuz to international traffic and guaranteeing safe passage. 2 days later, a parallel ceasefire was brokered between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, facilitated with Qatari and Iranian involvement. For a brief moment, it looked like the region was stepping back from the edge. It did not last. Israel continued conducting strikes inside southern Lebanon despite the truce, and Iran responded by declaring, again, that it was closing the Strait of Hormuz, framing the Israeli strikes as a violation of the broader understanding. The U.S. military flatly denied that characterization. On June 27th, the U.S. Navy's Joint Maritime Information Center opened a widened shipping route through the strait near Oman, a direct and deliberate signal that Washington was not going to let Iran's rhetorical claims translate into functional control over a waterway that carries roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day, close to 1/5 of the entire world's seaborne crude supply, through a channel barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That single fact is worth sitting with. 20% of the planet's oil trade squeezed through a strip of water you could see across on a clear day, with Iran on one shore and Oman on the other. That was late June. Now come back to the present. On July 7th, 2 commercial tankers were struck in the strait within a 24-hour window. The Qatari-owned LNG carrier Al Rekayat was hit and set ablaze, suffering engine room damage severe enough that the crew evacuated the vessel out of fear it could explode. The Saudi-flagged supertanker Wedyan was struck separately. Qatar publicly pointed the finger at Iran. Iranian state media hinted at responsibility without an official government claim, the kind of deniable signaling regimes use when they want an adversary to understand exactly who did something without providing the kind of formal admission that legally obligates a response. Less than a day later, the IRGC struck a third vessel. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not an accident. This was a campaign. The American response came fast, and it came in 2 forms simultaneously, financial and kinetic, which is worth pausing on because it tells you how deliberately layered this retaliation was designed to be. On the financial side, the US Treasury Department moved to reimpose oil sanctions on Iran that had only been lifted weeks earlier under the terms of the Islamabad MOU, revoking a license that had permitted Iran to produce, sell, and deliver crude oil through the end of August. Less than 20 days after that sanctions relief had been granted as an act of good faith, it was gone. On the kinetic side, Central Command launched the first wave of strikes, hitting more than 80 Iranian military targets in a single operation conducted in response to the tanker attacks. Iranian military leadership vowed what they called a crushing response, and insisted no foreign power would be permitted to interfere with their management of the strait. But the strikes did not stop there. That brings us to the detail that changes everything about how this needs to be understood. A second wave followed on July 8th, striking approximately 90 additional targets concentrated heavily along Iran's coastline facing the strait. This wave came after President Trump publicly declared that he believed the fragile ceasefire was, in his words, over, and after he described Iran's leadership using blunt, undiplomatic language that left no ambiguity about where Washington's patience had run out. Strike footage geolocated from that wave showed a maritime control tower in the port city of Chabahar taking direct hits, confirmed by local Iranian officials themselves, even as state media downplayed the damage. And in a detail that surprised many analysts, video also emerged showing damage to a railway bridge near Akala in Iran's Golestan province, roughly 900 miles from the strait itself, a strike so far outside the immediate maritime theater that it signaled something important. This was no longer a narrowly contained response to a shipping dispute. It was beginning to look like a broader campaign against Iranian military logistics, wherever Washington judged it useful to strike. Now let's talk about what nobody covering this as a straightforward shipping dispute is fully connecting. Iran's chief negotiator, the same Ghalibaf now posting warnings on social media, had signed a document just weeks earlier explicitly promising something specific. The Islamabad memorandum stated that upon signing, Iran would make arrangements using its best efforts to guarantee the safe, no-charge passage of commercial vessels through the strait for a period of 60 days. 60 days, that was the ask. Not permanent open access forever. Not some sweeping concession that would have been difficult to honor. 60 days of restraint in exchange for sanctions relief and the lifting of a naval blockade that was actively strangling Iran's oil exports. Iran could not make it 2 weeks. Go through that agreement point by point, and the gap between what it claims and what actually happened becomes impossible to explain away. The memorandum promised safe passage. Iran attacked at least 3 vessels inside the very corridor it had pledged to protect, including one, the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy, that was set ablaze with significant engine room damage, severe enough to force a full crew evacuation. One crew member from that ship remains unaccounted for as of this writing. The memorandum implied Iran would use its best efforts to keep the waterway functional for global commerce. Instead, the IRGC Navy formally declared the strait closed on the grounds that vessels were using what it called unauthorized routes, a justification that inverts the entire logic of an international waterway, since the whole legal premise of the Strait of Hormuz is that it is not Iran's to authorize or restrict in the first place under international maritime law. And when U.S. Central Command was asked to respond to Iran's closure declaration, it did not release a diplomatic statement. It stated plainly that Iran does not control the strait, that it remains an international waterway, and that American forces were positioned and prepared to keep it that way. Then it added 3 more targets to the strike list to make the point unmistakable. Read that carefully, because the phrase Iran used to justify striking these vessels was that ships were taking an unauthorized route. That single justification is the entire architecture of Iran's post-conflict strategy compressed into one sentence. It is an attempt to convert a choke point that belongs to no single nation into a toll gate that only Iran controls, using force to enforce a claim it has no legal standing to make, then wrapping that coercion in language that frames it as regulatory enforcement rather than what it actually is, which is extortion backed by drone strikes and missile fire against unarmed commercial mariners. This is the part of the story that gets lost in the noise of missile counts and strike totals. The strategic objective was never really about a handful of specific vessels taking a specific route. It was about establishing precedent, testing whether the world, exhausted by months of ceasefires and violations and renewed fighting, would simply accept a de facto Iranian toll booth on the world's most important oil corridor. The answer, at least from Washington's side, arrived within hours, and it arrived not as a diplomatic protest, but as Strike Package 3. Now let's talk about what that strike package and the two before it actually represent in terms of hardware and doctrine, because this is where the story stops being about statements and quotes and becomes about raw military capability. Confirmed footage and Central Command releases show carrier-based FA-18 Super Hornets flying in a strike configuration, launching in both nighttime and early morning sorties. F-35s were also involved, dropping 500-pound precision-guided munitions on hardened coastal targets. Guided missile destroyers positioned in the Gulf used their vertical launch systems to hit IRGC headquarters buildings, radar installations, and communications relay stations from standoff range, meaning Iranian air defense never got a meaningful opportunity to intercept the inbound fire before it landed. F-16s were also part of the package, and one image released by Central Command showed an F-16 loaded with multiple advanced precision kill weapon system rocket pods, a rocket that started life as an unguided munition and has since been converted into a laser-guided precision weapon specifically effective against small, fast, low-cost targets. That detail is not incidental. Loading a fighter with APKWS pods signals that American planners are specifically anticipating swarms of small Iranian attack drones and fast boats, the exact kind of asymmetric threat Iran has relied on for years, precisely because it is cheap to build and expensive to defend against with traditional munitions. The same F-16s were also seen carrying GBU-54 laser JDAMs, a weapon worth understanding because the choice to use it here is itself a message. The GBU-54 is a dual guidance bomb, meaning it can be steered either by laser designation or by GPS coordinates, and critically, it can switch between the two mid-flight. In a contested environment, where a pilot might need to break off a laser lock to perform defensive maneuvers against incoming fire, a purely laser-guided weapon becomes unreliable, since the bomb will simply fly toward wherever the laser was last pointed if that beam gets interrupted. The GBU-54 solves that problem by falling back on GPS guidance the instant the laser goes dark, correcting itself once the pilot reacquires the target. That is a weapon built for exactly the kind of high-threat, contested airspace that a strike campaign against an adversary still firing ballistic missiles and launching drones would represent. Choosing this platform over simpler alternatives tells you the planners were not assuming an uncontested environment. They were preparing for Iranian air defense and small boat swarm attacks and built the strike package to survive both. And this is where it gets significantly worse for Iran's own military calculus. Every one of those American assets, the Super Hornets, the F-35s, the destroyers, the F-16s, is operating from a position of near total technological and doctrinal superiority over what Iran can field in response. Iran's counterstrikes have consisted primarily of ballistic missiles launched at Gulf state targets and American positions, along with drone barrages, and a reverse-engineered Chinese anti-ship cruise missile derivative known as the C-802. Believed to have an effective range beyond 100 nautical miles, giving it real reach against shipping and coastal infrastructure. That is a genuine capability. It is not nothing. But footage from these strikes has repeatedly shown Iranian ballistic missiles being intercepted before impact, and independent reporting has noted that a significant share of the missiles Iran claims are striking. Their intended targets are, in reality, either being shot down or simply failing to reach their targets at all. Iran is running its ballistic missile force through a finite magazine against an adversary with layered, hardened, actively integrated air defense protecting the targets Iran is trying to hit. Every fast boat destroyed by an American attack helicopter or an armed MQ-9 drone. Every radar site taken offline by a HARM anti-radiation missile. Every ammunition depot that goes up in a secondary explosion after a JDAM strike. All of it represents capability that does not regenerate quickly, if at all, for a country already operating under reimposed sanctions and reduced access to the international financial system needed to rebuild advanced weapon stockpiles. This is the part most people covering the headline numbers are missing entirely, because the story is not really about 3 nights of airstrikes in isolation. It is about 3 simultaneous pressure tracks converging on Iran at the exact same moment, each one reinforcing the others in a way that produces an effect far larger than any single track could produce alone. The first track is financial. The Treasury Department's decision to reimpose oil sanctions within days of the tanker attacks stripped Iran of the exact economic relief it had just secured through diplomacy, meaning the entire strategic logic of signing the Islamabad Memorandum in the first place, trading maritime restraint for sanctions relief, evaporated almost immediately, leaving Iran worse off economically than if it had simply maintained the terms of the deal. The second track is military. 3 consecutive strike waves expanding in scope each time, from roughly 80 targets to 90 to 140, have systematically degraded the coastal military infrastructure Iran depends on to project any credible threat against shipping in the strait, meaning the physical capability underlying Iran's closure declaration is being dismantled in real time, even as the declaration itself is being repeated publicly. The third track is psychological. President Trump's public description of Iran's leadership using blunt, contemptuous language, combined with Central Command's terse, almost dismissive public statements, flatly rejecting Iran's claims of control over the strait, is designed to project total confidence and strip away any perception that Iran retains leverage in this confrontation, a psychological posture reinforced every time American forces demonstrably keep commercial traffic moving despite Iran's declared closure. Those 3 tracks landing simultaneously is what makes this moment different from earlier phases of the conflict. Financial pressure alone gives Iran time to adapt and find workarounds through shadow fleets and sanctioned intermediaries, something Tehran has done for years. Military pressure alone can be absorbed and narrated domestically as heroic resistance against imperial aggression, a framing the Iranian government has relied on since 1979. Psychological pressure alone changes nothing if the underlying capability and financial cushion remain intact. But when all 3 land in the same 72-hour window, the effect compounds. Iran's economic lifeline is cut off right as its military capacity to enforce its own maritime claims is being physically destroyed, right as the international narrative is being shaped in near real time by footage and official statements that directly contradict Tehran's version of events. That is not resistance. That is a regime narrating a position of strength, while the actual verifiable operational picture on the ground tells a completely different story. Now let's go inside the actual decision-making structure driving Iran's side of this, because the gap between the public messaging and the real chain of command is significant, and it explains a great deal about why Iran's stated position keeps colliding with reality. Publicly, President Masoud Pezeshkian signed the Islamabad Memorandum and is nominally the head of state who committed Iran to 60 days of safe passage. But Pezeshkian does not command Iran's naval forces in the strait. That authority sits with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, a separate military structure from Iran's conventional armed forces, answerable ultimately to Iran's supreme leader rather than to the elected president, and historically the branch of Iran's security apparatus most willing to act unilaterally and aggressively, particularly around the strait, where IRGC fast attack boats and coastal missile units have harassed shipping for years, even during periods of formal diplomatic engagement. Mohammad Ghalibaf, the parliamentary speaker posting defiant statements online, occupies a powerful political lane, but he is also not the operational commander pulling the trigger on strikes against tankers. What you have, functionally, is a negotiating track run by Pezeshkian's government and figures like Ghalibaf, producing signed agreements and public statements aimed at the international community, running in parallel with an IRGC operational track that has repeatedly acted in ways that undercut those same agreements within days or weeks of them being signed. Whether that reflects genuine institutional fragmentation inside Iran's power structure, deliberate strategic ambiguity designed to give Tehran deniability, or simply the IRGC pursuing its own institutional interests and maintaining leverage over the strait regardless of what the civilian negotiating track agrees to, is difficult to state with certainty from the outside. What can be stated with confidence is the pattern itself. Iran signs. Iran violates within weeks. Iran blames external provocation. And the cycle resets, each time with the underlying military capability Iran depends on to enforce its threats a little further degraded than it was before. So where does the honest strategic assessment actually land, separate from either government's official framing? Despite Iran's declared closure of the strait, commercial shipping traffic has not actually stopped. More than 800 vessels have continued transiting the corridor since this latest escalation began, carrying an estimated 400 million barrels of crude, a volume of traffic that simply could not move through a strait that was genuinely, physically closed. What has changed is the character of that traffic. The U.S. Navy's Joint Maritime Information Center has been actively managing a widened southern shipping corridor closer to Omani waters, effectively routing traffic around the areas where Iranian forces have concentrated their attacks, while American warships and aircraft provide de facto protection along that route. Oman, for its part, has been pushing a tentative compromise floated in diplomatic meetings with Iran's foreign minister, proposing a dual route system that would give Iran and international shippers separately managed corridors through the strait, an arrangement that would let Tehran save face domestically while removing its practical ability to interdict traffic it does not control. Whether that proposal survives the current round of strikes, or whether it becomes yet another framework signed with fanfare and abandoned within weeks like the Islamabad memorandum before it, is the open question hanging over the next several days of diplomacy. What the available evidence suggests about the near-term trajectory is this. Iran's ability to enforce its own closure declaration is shrinking with every strike package, while the United States continues to demonstrate, through both action and blunt public statement, that it is prepared to escalate the scope of targets rather than negotiate under the threat of a blockade that it does not consider legitimate in the first place. That imbalance tends to produce one of two outcomes. Either Iran's political leadership, facing a military establishment that cannot back up its own threats, and an economy now stripped of the sanctions relief it had just secured, moves towards some version of the Omani dual route compromise to end the immediate bleeding, or the IRGC, institutionally invested in maintaining coercive leverage over the strait regardless of the cost, continues launching attacks on shipping and absorbing American retaliation, a path that functionally guarantees continued strikes on Iranian territory with no clear ceiling, since Central Command has already shown a willingness to expand its target list to infrastructure hundreds of miles from the strait itself when it judges the response warranted. But here's the structural risk that should concern anyone watching this closely, the variable that matters more than the daily target counts. It is not really about whether Iran can physically close the strait, because at this point the evidence strongly suggests it cannot sustain that in the face of an active American interdiction effort. The real risk is the fragmentation inside Iran's own command structure, the gap between what Iran's diplomats sign and what its IRGC forces actually do in the field. That fragmentation makes de-escalation structurally difficult, because even if Pezeshkian's government wanted to genuinely honor a ceasefire or a new maritime arrangement, there is no guarantee the IRGC Navy would comply, and there is no clean mechanism for the international community to verify which version of Iran, the negotiating table version or the operational version, actually controls the guns pointed at commercial shipping on any given day. That uncertainty is exactly the kind of condition that produces accidental escalation, a single strike, a single missed intercept, a single miscommunication between an IRGC fast boat commander and a nervous American destroyer crew that spirals beyond what either side's political leadership actually intended. And that uncertainty is not confined to the missiles and the warships. Underneath this entire confrontation, Western intelligence services have been quietly documenting a parallel campaign that reveals just how far modern conflict now extends beyond conventional battlefields. Dutch intelligence agencies recently disclosed that a Kremlin-linked hacking group they have named Laundry Bear compromised ordinary civilian devices, including consumer video doorbells and home security cameras, positioned along military transport corridors across the Netherlands and other NATO member states, using nothing more sophisticated than default factory passwords and outdated firmware to turn everyday consumer electronics into a distributed surveillance network capable of tracking the movement of military equipment headed toward Ukraine. Dutch officials noted the technique bears a direct resemblance to methods reportedly used by Israeli and American intelligence in tracking senior Iranian military figures ahead of earlier strikes in the same broader conflict. It is a reminder that the war unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz and the war grinding on in Ukraine are not as separate as they might appear on a map, and that the tools of modern intelligence gathering have become so cheap and so ubiquitous that a $40 camera on someone's front door can, without its owner ever knowing, become a node in a state intelligence apparatus watching a war unfold from thousands of miles away. So return for a moment to where this started, to that image of Iranian military infrastructure going dark across a single night, target by target, while Iran's own chief negotiator was online, insisting that the era of one-sided deals was over and that the strait would only reopen on Iranian terms. As of this writing, that strait is neither fully open in the way it existed before this crisis began, nor is it closed in the way Iran has repeatedly declared. It exists in a strange, contested middle state, patrolled and functionally controlled along its southern approaches by American and allied naval power, while Iran continues to insist, publicly, that the opposite is true. Whether that contradiction resolves through the kind of dual-route diplomatic compromise Oman has been quietly pushing, or through a fourth, fifth, and sixth wave of strikes that further hollow out what remains of Iran's coastal military capacity, is not yet decided. What is clear is that the gap between what Tehran says and what its own forces can actually enforce has never been wider. And every hour that gap persists is another hour in which someone, somewhere along that 21-mile stretch of water, has to decide what happens next.